There is a specific kind of quiet that settles into a house after the children leave. Not the quiet of a library, or of an early morning before the day begins. Something different, a quiet that has weight to it. You walk past a bedroom and the door is open now, because there is no reason to close it. You make dinner and realize, without thinking, that you have cooked enough for more people than are there. You pick up the phone on a Sunday afternoon, not because anything is wrong, but because something feels missing, and you cannot quite name what it is. Most people who have lived long enough know this feeling. They may not speak about it directly. It sits in the background of daily life the way a low sound does, not loud enough to address, but persistent enough that you notice it. And yet, if you asked them to describe the feeling precisely, many would struggle. It is not exactly loneliness. It is not grief, not quite. It is something more like a quiet bewilderment, a sense that the family life they expected, the one they perhaps experienced as children or imagined when they were raising their own, arrived differently than they thought it would. The calls are less frequent. The visits feel shorter. The grandchildren are polite but distracted. The adult children are busy in ways that are difficult to explain and harder to argue with. Everyone is technically reachable. No one has gone anywhere that requires a long journey. And still, something about it feels far. This is not a rare experience. It is one of the most common quiet griefs of midlife and later life, and it is one of the least discussed. People speak more easily about money worries, health concerns, even the fear of death, than they speak about the feeling that their family has drifted. It is the kind of thing mentioned briefly at the end of a conversation, almost as a footnote, before the topic changes to something more manageable. Part of the reason it goes unnamed is that it is difficult to complain about without sounding ungrateful, or demanding, or out of touch. Adult children have their own lives. That is supposed to be a good thing. Modern families are more independent. That is supposed to represent progress. And so the feeling gets swallowed quietly, tucked away as evidence of something personal. Perhaps a failure of expectations, perhaps a failure of character. And yet the feeling persists. And the people who carry it often wonder, in the quieter moments, whether they did something wrong. Whether they should have done something differently. Whether they are simply expecting too much from people who love them but live too far away to show it the way love used to be shown. There is something else that makes the feeling hard to talk about. It implicates people you love. To say that family life feels distant is, in some small way, to criticize the people in that family. Even if that is not the intention. Even if the real target is something abstract, the economy, the culture, the passage of time, the observation still lands close to the people who matter most. And no one wants to make that landing hurt. So the quiet continues, and the distance is absorbed rather than named. And another year passes in which the conversations that might have happened did not. Today, we are going to sit with that feeling and try to understand it honestly. Not with blame, not with easy prescriptions about putting down your phone or scheduling more family dinners. Those suggestions are not wrong, exactly, but they are too small for what we are actually describing. What we are describing is a shift that happened across an entire society over several decades, in the economy, in housing policy, in how people move and work and communicate, in what the culture tells people to value and pursue. Understanding that shift does not make the quiet easier to bear. It does not fill the empty rooms or bring the missed calls back. But it can change what the quiet means. It can replace a private bewilderment with a clearer picture of how the world actually changed. And sometimes, clarity is enough to make the carrying easier. To understand where we are, it helps to go back about 50 years, not because the past was perfect, but because the distance between then and now is large enough to see clearly. In the 1950s and into the 1960s, most Americans lived within a short distance of where they grew up. The economy was largely local and regional. Factories, farms, retail businesses, local services. These were the places where people worked, and they were rooted to specific places. If you grew up in a mill town in Pennsylvania or a farming community in Iowa or a small city in the South, The odds were reasonable that your adult life would unfold in the same general area. Your children might move to the next town, perhaps to a nearby city. But they generally stayed within driving distance of home. This was not romantic. There were real costs to that kind of rootedness: limited opportunity, limited perspective, limited freedom for the many people whose lives did not fit neatly into the local mold. Women who wanted careers found few pathways. Young people who were different in any number of ways felt trapped. The post-war years, for all their apparent stability, carried their own quiet suppressions, their own forms of suffocation that we should not pretend were minor. But one of the things that came with geographic proximity, alongside everything else, good and bad, was the ordinary texture of family life. The texture that does not require anyone to announce it or plan for it. Unannounced Sunday visits. Grandparents who lived close enough to know their grandchildren's friends by name. Holiday gatherings that happened because everyone was within a few hours' drive, not because elaborate arrangements had been made. A phone call that turned into an actual visit, because an actual visit was possible. That texture began to loosen in the 1970s, and it has been loosening ever since. The economy started to nationalize and then globalize. Good jobs were no longer reliably available where you were born. Manufacturing moved, first to the American South, then overseas. Corporate structures consolidated, pulling decision-making into headquarters cities. The advice that began circulating: follow the opportunity, go where the work is, do not let geography limit you, reflected a real change in how the economy functioned. Staying in your hometown was no longer a neutral choice. In many cases, it became a financial sacrifice. And the people who made that sacrifice often watched their hometowns slowly hollow out around them as the ones who left did not come back. Then came the cost of housing. Through the 1950s, 1960s, and into the early 1970s, housing in most American cities and towns was, by historical standards, accessible to working families. Not easy, not without effort and sacrifice, but possible, in a way that did not require 2 full professional incomes or a 30-year mortgage consuming the majority of what a family earned. That changed over the following decades. Through the late 1970s, 1980s, and especially from the 1990s onward, housing prices in desirable urban and suburban areas climbed steadily and sharply, while wages for most workers did not climb at the same pace. The result was that younger generations found themselves priced out of the places their parents lived. The house that their parents bought on a single income in the 1970s was worth several times more by the time their children were ready to form families of their own, and buying anything comparable required income levels that only specific cities and industries could provide. To find affordable housing near good employment, younger people had to go where the jobs and the lower costs converged, which was rarely where their parents were. This was not a choice made lightly or out of indifference to family. It was the economic logic of a changed world pressing on people whose options had quietly narrowed. Add to this the expansion of college education as the expected path for a large portion of the middle class. By the late 20th century, going to college had become not just common but normative, the thing you were supposed to do, the credential that separated reasonable prospects from limited ones. And college almost always meant leaving home. Genuinely leaving, often to another state, sometimes to another region of the country entirely. What had once been a temporary departure, 4 years away, then a return to adult life somewhere near family, became, for many, the first permanent separation. The young person went to college, found a social world there, built friendships and sometimes partnerships there, and then followed the job market to wherever it led. The hometown became a place you returned to for Thanksgiving, not a place you built your life. This was not betrayal. It was the outcome of choices that the culture collectively encouraged, without ever fully accounting for their long-term cost to the relationships they left behind. Within the family unit itself, something else was changing simultaneously. In 1960, roughly 1 in 3 married women worked outside the home. By the end of the century, that figure had risen significantly, and dual-income households had become not a lifestyle preference but a practical necessity for the majority of middle-class families. Two incomes were required to maintain the living standards that had once been achievable on one. Housing costs, childcare costs, healthcare costs, these had all risen in ways that made a single income increasingly inadequate. This was significant for family life in ways that are easy to underestimate. Time does not expand to accommodate what we ask of it. When both parents work full days, evenings become compressed. Weekends fill with the tasks that could not be completed during the week. Extended family contact, the long Sunday visit, the midweek dinner with parents or in-laws, the spontaneous drop-in, becomes something that has to be scheduled, and scheduled things carry a different quality than spontaneous ones. The easy, natural rhythm of family life gave way to a more managed, more deliberate one. Contact was real, but it required effort in a way it once had not. And then, beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating sharply through the 2010s, came the mobile phone and the wholesale transformation of how people communicate. Staying in touch became, technically speaking, easier than it had ever been in human history. You could send a message to anyone, anywhere, instantly, at essentially no cost. You could see someone's face on a small screen from across the country. You could share photographs of children growing up, of holidays, of ordinary Tuesday evenings. You could be present, in some narrow sense, without being present at all. The temptation was to interpret this as a solution to the problem of distance. Look how connected we are. You can reach your daughter on the other side of the country in seconds. The grandchildren send pictures from school. You can see their faces whenever you want. In one narrow and literal sense, all of that is true. But what the technology offered was contact, not presence. A text message is not the same as sitting at the same table. A video call is not the same as sharing a meal, with all the silences and distractions and small observations that a shared meal naturally contains. The warmth of an unscheduled conversation, when something important gets said because the conditions happen to be right, cannot be replicated through a screen at an appointed hour. What technology did, in many families, was lower the threshold for what counted as staying in touch. A quick text on a birthday, a few messages around the holidays, a reaction to a photograph. These gestures became a substitute for the deeper forms of contact they once supplemented rather than replaced. And because they felt like connection, because they activated some of the same feelings that real contact had once activated, they made the absence of genuine presence easier to overlook, for everyone involved, for longer than was perhaps good for anyone. Numbers and historical patterns explain why something happened. They cannot fully describe what it feels like from the inside. So consider, for a moment, the experience of a parent in their 60s or 70s who has two adult children, both of whom live several hours away by plane, both of whom have their own demanding jobs, their own mortgages, their own children who need to be driven to school and activities and doctors. This parent worked hard, stayed in one place, tried to create a home that felt like somewhere worth returning to. They expected, perhaps without ever stating it clearly, because it did not need to be stated, because it seemed obvious, that family life would continue to have a certain rhythm. Regular visits, holidays together, perhaps eventually grandchildren who knew them well enough to call without prompting, who knew their grandparents' stories and habits and the particular way they laughed. What actually arrived was something quieter and less certain. The visits happen, but not often. Twice a year, perhaps 3 times if something important brings everyone together. When they arrive, everyone is glad to be there. The love is genuine and visible. But there is also a thinness to it. A sense that the visit is trying to accomplish too much in too little time, that conversations are touching the surface of things that would require weeks of ordinary contact to go deeper. The phone calls are real, but they tend to be brief. 10 minutes to catch up on the children's schooling, a quick mention of a work situation, a question about how the other person is feeling, and then someone has another obligation. The conversation ends with warmth and genuine intention. We'll talk again soon. And soon sometimes means the following week, and sometimes means the following month, and time passes in ways that no one intended. The birthday text arrives. It is warm and it is genuine. The person who sent it meant it. But it is also 3 sentences long, written in less than a minute, sent between 2 other things on a busy day. And the parent who receives it understands, on some level, that this is what contact looks like now. They are grateful for it. They do not want to seem ungrateful, because the gratitude is real. They know their child is busy. They know the intention behind the message is good. They know there is no malice in brevity. And so they say nothing about what the brevity costs them. This silence is one of the most under-examined parts of the whole experience. Parents who feel the gap, who notice the calls becoming less frequent, the visits shorter, the texture of the relationship lighter than they had expected, often choose not to name it directly. Naming it feels like placing a burden on their children. It feels like an accusation, even when no accusation is intended. It feels, sometimes, like a confession of need, and there is a particular kind of dignity in many people of that generation that expresses itself as not needing, as managing, as being fine. So the parent absorbs the quiet, says it is okay when they are asked, talks to a friend or to a spouse or to no one about the feeling they cannot quite put down. And another season passes. The adult children, meanwhile, are often carrying something they also do not name. Many of them feel a low-grade guilt about the distance. Not a sharp guilt, not the guilt of someone who knows they have done something wrong, but a background guilt, like a sound you cannot locate. They know, without being told, that their parents would like to see them more. They intend to visit more. They plan, genuinely, to call more often. But the week fills up in the particular way that modern weeks fill up, with obligations that do not yield to good intentions. The job is demanding and the competition is real. The children need attention and care and time. The budget is tight and the flight is expensive. And another month passes in which the call that was planned did not happen. This is not indifference. It is exhaustion meeting complexity, inside an economic structure that does not leave much margin. Many adults in their 30s and 40s are living lives that leave very little room, financially, professionally, emotionally, for much beyond what is directly in front of them. They are not neglecting their parents out of selfishness. They are doing what they can inside a set of pressures that are genuinely significant. But from a distance of several hundred miles, the distinction between neglect and overwhelm can be impossible to see. And then there is the experience of the grandchildren. For many grandparents, this is where the feeling becomes most specific and most tender. They see photographs of grandchildren growing up on small screens. The first day of school, a birthday party, a soccer game. They receive drawings in the mail, occasionally, which are kept longer than most other things. They know the children's names and their general personalities from descriptions given during phone calls. They know one likes animals and one is shy and one is already showing signs of a particular talent. But they do not know them in the way that closeness allows. They do not know the small daily habits, the private jokes, the texture of who these children are on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing special is happening. They have not seen them tired, or sick, or working through a problem, or bored on a rainy afternoon. They have seen them during visits, which are heightened and slightly performative, in the way that all special occasions are. But they have not seen them live. This kind of not knowing is its own particular loss. It is not dramatic. No one died. No relationship was severed. The grandchildren are kind during visits and the love is real on both sides. But there is a thinness to it, a feeling that the connection has not had enough time and enough ordinariness to become something solid. What makes all of this harder is that the culture offers almost no language for it. There are words for grief when someone dies. There are words for loneliness when a person has no family at all. But the specific experience of having a family that is loving and alive and simply not present in the way you need it to be, that experience sits in a space that culture rarely addresses directly. It is too ordinary to be called tragedy, too persistent and too real to be dismissed as sentimentality. And so it goes unnamed, carried privately, mentioned sideways in conversations that quickly move on to something easier. That silence, not the distance itself, but the silence around the distance, is one of the things that makes the weight of it hardest to put down. There is a question underneath all of this that is worth asking directly. What did family proximity actually do? Not in a sentimental sense, but in a practical and human one. Why did it matter so much? And what, specifically, was lost when it became optional, something chosen or not chosen rather than something simply assumed? The honest answer is that family closeness served purposes that are not easy to replace. The most visible of these was practical support. Before the era in which professional services could be purchased for almost every need, families were the primary safety net for most people. When someone was ill, family cared for them, not a paid caregiver who arrived on a schedule, but a daughter or a sister or a neighbor who came because that is what you did. When someone needed help with young children, family provided it. When money was short or a car needed repair or a hard decision needed a second opinion, family was often the first resource, not the last. This was not always comfortable. Mutual dependence creates friction. It creates obligations and imbalances and moments of resentment. Families who lived close to each other sometimes wished for more distance. The privacy that geographic separation provides is real and valuable. But the support was also real. And as families dispersed, that support became harder to access. You cannot call your daughter to watch the grandchildren for an afternoon when she lives in another state. You cannot ask your parents for help with a decision at 11 at night when a phone call feels like too much of an imposition at that hour. The professional alternatives, paid childcare, delivery services, senior care agencies, therapy, exist, and sometimes work well. But they are expensive, and they are impersonal in a way that changes the nature of the help. Being helped by someone who loves you is not the same as being helped by someone who is paid to be there. The practical dimension matters, but there is something else that was transmitted through proximity that cannot be transmitted any other way. It can be called the ordinary inheritance of family life. This is harder to name but perhaps even more significant. When generations live near each other and spend real, unhurried time together, knowledge moves between them in ways that do not require formal teaching. A grandmother who is present in a grandchild's daily life does not have to sit down and deliberately explain how she thinks about patience, or what she learned from the difficult years of her own marriage, or what her mother used to say when things went wrong. These things are transmitted through observation, through conversation while doing other things, through the accumulated hours of simply being near someone who has lived longer and seen more. You learn how to handle disappointment by watching someone handle it. You learn what a long marriage looks like not from a description but from being present in one, day after day, seeing the small negotiations and the quiet kindnesses and the way two people move around each other after decades of practice. You learn what it means to age with dignity not from a talk but from being near someone who is doing it. Distance does not make this kind of transmission impossible, but it makes it rare and deliberate, something that has to be scheduled like a lesson, rather than something that happens naturally in the course of shared daily life. The result, accumulated over decades, is that many people in their 20s and 30s have grandparents they love genuinely but do not truly know. The relationship is warm and real, but thin, lacking the depth that only time and proximity can create. What gets transmitted through close family life, at its best, is a kind of living memory. Not just the memory of events, the stories that get told at the table, but the memory of how to live. The habits that a grandmother brought from her own childhood, the ones she absorbed from her mother, the ones that survived because they were demonstrated rather than described. The small rituals of daily life that nobody invented and nobody named but that carry, embedded in them, years of accumulated human understanding. How to receive bad news. How to be with someone who is grieving. How to make a decision when no choice is good. How to stay. These are the things that require presence to survive. They cannot be adequately transmitted through a screen, through visits that happen twice a year, through the curated version of a life that gets shared on a phone. When families disperse, those threads begin to fray. Each generation starts slightly more from scratch, slightly less equipped with the invisible inheritance that closeness once quietly provided. This is a cultural loss as much as a personal one, though it is almost never discussed as either. But perhaps the deepest thing that close family life provides, the thing most difficult to name and most impossible to replace, is the simple, sustaining experience of being known. Not known in the way that acquaintances or colleagues know you. Known in the older, quieter sense, by people who hold the full record of who you are. People who remember you before you were who you are now. People who know your recurring mistakes, your particular fears, the version of you that shows up when you are tired or embarrassed or genuinely afraid. People who know the sound of your voice when something is wrong before you have said what it is. Being known in that way requires years. It requires proximity. It cannot be compressed into visits or reconstructed through text messages, no matter how warm those messages are. And what many people who feel the loss of family closeness are mourning, underneath everything else, is precisely this. Not just the contact, not just the visits, but the experience of being held in someone's full knowledge, of mattering to someone in a way that is not conditional on being available or convenient or impressive. Modern culture made a collective decision, largely without debating it openly, to prioritize individual mobility and achievement over communal belonging. The logic was economic and it seemed reasonable. People should go where they can flourish. Opportunity should not be permanently limited by geography. Individual potential should not be sacrificed on the altar of family obligation. What was not fully reckoned with was the price. Not for any particular person, necessarily. For the fabric of family life across a whole society. The price was paid slowly, in the accumulation of shorter visits and less frequent calls, in the thinning of relationships that might once have been deep, in the growing unfamiliarity between people who love each other but do not have time to know each other well. In the quiet confusion of parents who did everything right, by every measure the culture offered them, and still found themselves, later in life, in a house that feels too quiet. It is worth naming that price clearly. Not to assign blame, and not to undo decisions that cannot be undone. But because understanding it honestly, without the softening of nostalgia or the hardening of resentment, is the only way to carry it without it becoming something that corrodes the relationships still within reach. The longing for family closeness is not weakness. It is not the inability to adapt to a changing world. It is not the sentimental error of someone who never accepted that their children had to grow up and move on. It is the recognition of something genuinely valuable that was lost. And that recognition has earned the right to be taken seriously. There is no clean resolution to what we have been describing. The economy that dispersed families was not built by accident and will not be rebuilt around sentiment. The housing costs that pushed young adults to distant cities did not create themselves, and they will not recede because parents miss their children. The culture that made individual achievement its highest aspiration did not develop in a generation and will not reverse in one. These are real conditions that shape real lives, and acknowledging them honestly is not despair. It is the beginning of seeing the situation as it actually is, rather than as we wish it were. But understanding where the distance came from, genuinely understanding it, tracing it back through the decades of economic and cultural change that created it, does something important. It changes the interpretation of the silence. When a Sunday passes without a call, it is possible to receive that silence as a verdict. As evidence that you were not important enough, or that something went wrong in the raising, or that the love you thought was mutual was less substantial than you believed. That interpretation is understandable. In the absence of another explanation, it fills the silence the way a bad thought fills a sleepless night. And it is, in most cases, wrong. The adult child who did not call this Sunday is more likely overwhelmed than indifferent. The grandchildren who seem not to feel the distance are not cold, they simply have not been given enough time together to feel its weight. The family that gathers twice a year and feels slightly awkward at first has not fallen apart. It is only trying to compress months of missed ordinariness into a few days, which is always a slightly imperfect operation. Understanding this does not eliminate the ache. But it can replace resentment with something more accurate, and accuracy is more useful than resentment for everyone involved. There is still room, in many families, to say the thing that goes unsaid. Not as an accusation and not as a complaint, but simply as a true statement offered without an agenda. I miss you. Said clearly, without the weight of everything that has been absorbed silently, it is often the beginning of a different kind of conversation. Not one that solves the distance, but one that acknowledges it honestly, between people who love each other and are both living inside the same difficult set of conditions. These conversations are harder to start than they should be. There is always the risk of seeming needy, of disrupting the careful balance of a relationship that has learned to function at a distance. But the risk of not starting them, of continuing to absorb the quiet without ever naming it, of letting silence become the permanent texture of the relationship, is its own kind of loss. A slower one, but not a smaller one. Some of what dispersal took cannot be recovered. The daily contact, the spontaneous visit, the years of shared ordinariness, these require proximity to exist, and proximity cannot always be rebuilt. That is a real loss, and it deserves to be mourned honestly, without pretending that it is not a loss or that it will feel better soon. But some things still can be tended. A longer call, when the time exists for one. A visit that is unhurried, that allows a full day of nothing in particular rather than the compressed agenda of a holiday. A letter written by hand, which carries a different weight than a message on a screen. Something physical, something that required someone to stop and think and mean the words rather than tap them quickly between other things. The decision, when you are together, to be fully there rather than filling the shared hours with the noise of ordinary distraction. None of this is a cure. Family life is not a problem to be solved. It is a relationship to be carried through time, imperfectly, with the patience that imperfect things require. Perhaps the most useful thing to take away from all of this is simply that the feeling is real and it is legitimate. The quiet that settles in when family life does not feel the way it was supposed to. That quiet is not imaginary. It is not the product of unreasonable expectations. It is not a failure of gratitude for what you do have. It is the honest response to a loss that the culture rarely acknowledges directly, because the culture has not yet found adequate language for a grief that does not fit neatly into any recognized category. You are not alone in feeling it. The people who raised their children with love and stayed in one place and waited for the calls that came less frequently than they had expected, they are not unusual. They are living the unacknowledged cost of a set of economic and cultural choices that were made, often in the name of progress and opportunity, without anyone fully accounting for what they would leave behind. Knowing that does not bring anyone back to the table. It does not make the house feel less quiet on the evenings when quiet is the most present thing in it. But it puts the silence in a different light, less like a verdict on the life you built, and more like a condition of the world you happen to live through. A world that changed faster than its values did, that moved people around for reasons that made sense economically but were never fully honest about what they cost in human terms. And sometimes, understanding the world you are living in is the quietest, most useful thing you can do. Not because it changes anything, but because it makes the carrying a little cleaner, a little less alone. Suggested thumbnail text. Families feel different. Why family change? The quiet distance. Families grew apart. Something shifted. Suggested video description. Something has quietly changed inside the American family. Not all at once, and not because of any single decision. But over the last few decades, the texture of family life has shifted. The Sunday dinners, the unannounced visits, the long phone calls, the feeling that your family was always somewhere nearby. In this episode of The Quiet Briefing, we explore why families feel more distant today, even when everyone is technically reachable. We look at what changed economically, socially, and technologically over the last 50 years. We consider the emotional cost, for parents, for grandparents, and for adult children who are often more overwhelmed than indifferent. And we ask what, if anything, can be understood more clearly about the family life that many people expected and the one they are actually living. This is not a video about blame. It is about understanding something real that millions of people feel but rarely hear described. The Quiet Briefing, calm, long-form reflections on money, aging, society, and modern life. Fact check notes. The following claims should be verified before recording. Verify current statistics on geographic mobility of adult children relative to parents in the U.S. What percentage live more than 2 hours from their parents, and how this has changed since the 1970s. Pew Research Center has published data on this. Verify the average distance adult children now live from their parents. Pew Research data from around 2019 suggested roughly 27% of adults lived more than 2 hours from their parents. Confirm the most recent figure. Verify trends in multi-generational household rates over the last 50 years. Pew has published data showing multi-generational living declined from the mid-20th century before partially rebounding post-2000 for economic reasons. Verify the claim that in 1960, roughly 1/3 of married women worked outside the home. This is a commonly cited figure from Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Confirm it is accurate. Verify that housing cost increases outpaced wage growth from the late 1970s onward. Federal Reserve, Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, or similar institutions have longitudinal data on this. Verify data on frequency of family contact across generations. Pew Research and the Survey Center on American Life have both published relevant data on how often Americans are in contact with parents and extended family. Verify percentage of adults over 60 who report feeling lonely or socially isolated. AARP and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine have both published reports on social isolation among older adults. The claim that college attendance normalized permanent departure from hometowns is framed as a cultural observation rather than a specific statistic. No specific figure is cited, which is appropriate. Do not add a number here unless it can be sourced precisely. No specific housing price statistics or wage figures are cited as hard numbers in the script, which avoids the risk of outdated figures. If any are added in revision, they should be sourced and verified before recording.